I don't think that goes on very much anymore. I think it's very possible that the girls chase the producers around now.
Paul Newman exposed 9 of the most openly racist actors he said he couldn't stand from Hollywood's so-called golden age. And he carried that truth for over 50 years. Newman wasn't just a movie star with blue eyes and charm.
Newman wasn't just a movie star with blue eyes and charm. His music was bold when it mattered most. While many actors stayed quiet to music protect their paychecks, Newman marched beside Martin Luther King Jr. at the 1963 Music March on Washington. He even traveled to Gadsden, Alabama to support music desegregation efforts when tensions were high and cameras weren't always friendly. His music narrated civil rights documentaries and used his fame as a weapon for equality. Back then, speaking music up could wreck your career overnight. Richard Nixon saw him as such a problem that he put Newman on his official enemies list. Newman later said that was the greatest honor of his life. But standing up for justice meant he also saw the dark side of Hollywood up close. Behind the music-polished smiles and glamorous premieres, he worked with legends whose public images covered up private prejudice. Music he saw which actors resisted integration, supported segregation policies of the time, and music used their power to keep Hollywood exclusive and closed off to people of music color. Paul Newman has been making movies for more than a quarter of a century. One of his finest performances is his newest, The Verdict. I got a stacked music of stills from some of his most famous films and handing them to him one at a time. Music I asked him to look at the picture and tell me whatever came to his mind about that performance. One 3-time Music Academy Award winner was rumored to have reacted with shocking celebration music when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Another famous cowboy star once told a national magazine he believed music in white supremacy and never walked back his words. These weren't music harmless old comments or awkward jokes from another era. These were powerful men whose actions shaped careers and controlled access. Opportunities were blocked. Careers were crushed. An entire industry was shaped in a way that erased many communities from the screen. For decades, audiences grew up watching movies that barely reflected the real diversity of America. That didn't happen by accident. Music Now, the first name on this list, might catch you off guard. His prejudiced music didn't show up as loud insults. It hid behind patriotism, sharp suits, and polished interviews. Music coming in at number 9, Robert Taylor. On the outside, he looked like the perfect leading man of classic Hollywood. Dark music hair, sharp features, smooth confidence. He was everything a studio wanted to sell. Taylor was one of MGM's biggest stars. Music through the 1940s and 1950s. Fans saw romance, bravery, and charm every time he hit the music screen. What they didn't see was how he used his influence behind closed doors. When the House Un-American Activities Music Committee began investigating suspected communist ties in Hollywood, most actors feared being called in. Robert Taylor music didn't wait. He volunteered. He stepped into those hearings and named colleagues music he believed supported progressive causes, including civil rights efforts. Careers were damaged overnight. Music there was no hesitation. Taylor also helped found the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, a group that pushed back hard music against progressive voices in the industry, including those advocating for music racial integration. This wasn't subtle studio gossip. It was organized pressure. Music reports say he even urged his studio to remove writers he believed were too sympathetic music to civil rights causes. In Taylor's view, supporting equality for Black Americans wasn't music forward-thinking. He saw it as suspicious and un-American. That mindset shaped music real decisions with real consequences. Newman stood for everything Taylor rejected. One used his spotlight to push for fairness. The other used his to question and sideline those fighting for change. It was a clash of values, playing music out behind the glamour of red carpets and camera flashes. And Taylor wasn't alone. He wasn't the only golden age figure music who turned anti-communist fear into a weapon against people advocating for racial music equality. At number 8, Adolphe Menjou, the man who wrapped his actions music in the flag. In 1947, actor Adolphe Menjou stood before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and music made a bold statement that showed exactly where he stood. He once publicly claimed he was the most informed music person in America on communism. That bold statement revealed more about his biased music than any real expertise. Adolphe Manu had built a music-steady career as a polished, sophisticated character actor during Hollywood's golden music age. With his smooth style and European charm, he was the go-to man for roles that demanded music class and authority. But off-screen, Mangju poured that same intensity into attacking civil rights efforts, all while saying music was just defending America from communism. His version of communist music activity stretched far beyond politics. In his eyes, anyone who supported racial integration, fair treatment of minorities in Hollywood, or basic music civil rights for Black Americans was suspect. In Minju's twisted logic, believing Black actors deserved equal opportunity music meant you were part of a dangerous movement. That leap was serious, and it had real consequences. He played music a key role in pushing for blacklists that sidelined artists' music whose only real stance was supporting equality. Writers, directors, music and actors saw their careers collapse because Manju and others like Music Him blurred the line between patriotism and prejudice. Back then, music being labeled un-American could end everything overnight. And that label was handed out fast music and loose. Snort's Newman saw straight through it. He understood that figures like Minju wrapped their resistance music to change in patriotic language and called it loyalty. But the pattern music was clear. It wasn't just about communism. It was about control. It was about keeping an industry structured the same way music had always been, where power stayed in the same hands and new voices struggled to get in. Minju and Robert Taylor used politics as their music shield. The next name on the list didn't even bother hiding behind hearings or music committees. His controversies were tied to something far darker and far more unsettling. Music number 7, Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling icon with troubling associations. On screen, Flynn was pure adventure. He played Robin Hood, Captain Blood, and the fearless hero audiences adored. He had the grin, the swagger, the sword fights that made crowds cheer. He was magnetic. Fans packed theaters to see him leap across ships and win impossible battles. But behind that dazzling image, serious allegations followed him for years. Flynn faced repeated accusations of music Nazi sympathies during a time when the world was on edge. Reports placed him in Nazi Germany and in fascist-controlled Spain during the Spanish Civil War. These trips weren't framed music as simple tourism. Biographers later questioned his connections and raised concerns about the company he kept and the ideas he expressed. Researchers who dug music into his private life described disturbing links to Nazi operatives and documented racist music views toward Black and Jewish communities. His private letters, music, and recorded conversations painted a picture of a man who saw the world through a strict racial hierarchy shaped by his upbringing music in colonial Tasmania. Those beliefs didn't stay hidden in a diary. They showed up in how he spoke and behaved. Colleagues later described his casual use of music racial slurs and his visible discomfort working alongside minority performers. On set, his charm remained intact for music the cameras. But behind the scenes, the tone could shift fast. He carried music those attitudes as effortlessly as he carried a sword in his films, as if prejudice were music just another accessory of the era. Flynn's prejudice stayed hidden behind sword fights and that famous movie music star grin. But the next name might shock people even more. He was called Music, the king of Hollywood. And for decades, stories about his political ties and affiliations were pushed to the side. Number 6, Clark Gable, the king with a carefully guarded court. But we have a tendency in this country to make legends out of a great many characters. When Paul Newman stepped into Hollywood in the early 1950s, one legend still towered over the entire industry. Clark Music Gable, the man who played Rhett Butler, the face that defined what a leading man looked like for a whole generation. Studios built campaigns around him. Audiences worshipped him. His influence wasn't just big, it was massive. What often gets overlooked is how Gable used that influence behind the scenes. He was a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Music that group included powerful figures like Walt Disney and John Wayne. This wasn't just a name added to a list for show. The organization actively pushed back against progressive voices in Hollywood and opposed integration efforts within the industry. Music the Alliance worked to protect what they saw as traditional American values. But critics argued it also defended a system that kept Hollywood overwhelmingly white. Music members supported blacklists and applied pressure on studios when writers, directors, or actors were viewed music as too progressive. Gable stood with that movement while playing heroic, charming music characters that audiences adored on screen. Publicly, he was the symbol of romance and strength. Privately, music he aligned with forces determined to slow down change. Among insiders at the time, his opposition to progressive shifts in the industry was no secret. But to moviegoers, that side of the story rarely made headlines. Newman entered an industry shaped by men like Gable, a system carefully structured over decades where access and opportunity were tightly controlled. The King's Crown, some critics argue, music rested on a foundation that kept others out. That legacy still sparks debate today. But if Gable worked quietly music within powerful circles, the next actor didn't hide his views behind closed music doors. He put them on record in a national magazine interview, so music controversial that readers still react strongly when they revisit it. Music number 5, Robert Mitchum, the tough guy who questioned history music itself. Of everyone mentioned so far, Mitchum is the one who actually shared the screen with Paul Newman. They appeared together in the 1964 music comedy What a Way to Go, working side by side during a time when Newman was deeply involved in civil music rights activism. On screen, Mitchum had that effortless cool, heavy-lit eyes, deep calm voice. He became music one of cinema's most recognizable tough guys. But decades later, in 1983, Mitchum gave an interview to Esquire magazine that stunned music readers. When asked about the 6 million Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, he made comments that appeared to question or downplay the scale of the tragedy. The interview included anti-Semitic remarks and racially insensitive statements, music that shocked even the journalist conducting it. The backlash was immediate. Readers were outraged. Critics called the comments reckless and deeply offensive. Mitchum later responded with what many considered a weak explanation. He claimed he had been speaking in character from a recent music film role during the interview. In his written apology, he described the entire situation as a tragedy of music errors and suggested the reporter had misunderstood his tone. But Esquire never retracted the article. They stood by what was printed. For many, that interview permanently altered Mitchum's image. The laid-back rebel persona suddenly felt darker. It raised serious questions about music, what he truly believed, and how long those views had been there beneath the surface. Earlier in his career, Robert Mitchum reportedly turned down a starring role in The Defiant Ones, the groundbreaking film about racial tension and 2 escaped prisoners chained together. His stated reason was that he didn't believe a black man and a white man would ever be chained together in the segregated South. Some colleagues saw that explanation differently. They felt it showed he didn't want to share equal screen time with Sidney Poitier, who went on to earn major praise for the role, while Paul Newman was marching in Washington and risking his career to support civil rights. Mitchum was holding views that would later explode into public controversy. Their shared screen appearance in Music 1964 is a sharp reminder of how divided Hollywood could be. A man deeply involved in the fight for music equality could be standing next to someone who would later question the reality of the Holocaust. Music and audiences watching at home would never suspect a thing. Before moving to the final names on this list, it's important to understand who Paul Newman really was when it came to civil rights. His commitment wasn't trendy. It wasn't safe. And it definitely wasn't for publicity. In August 1963, Newman flew to Washington, D.C. alongside Marlon Brando, Sidney Poitier, and Harry Belafonte. He stood in the massive crowd and listened as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. But Newman didn't treat that moment like a photo opportunity. He went further. He traveled to Gadsden, Alabama to support desegregation drives at a time when violence was a real threat. He narrated documentaries about the civil rights movement, even though that made him a political target. He supported candidates who backed equality and donated to organizations working to dismantle segregation. He used his fame as leverage, not just decoration. Richard Nixon placed Newman on his official enemies list. Instead of backing down, Newman treated it like a badge of honor. While several of the men on this list were working to preserve a system that favored segregation, Newman was pushing hard in the opposite direction. He was willing to risk roles, relationships, and reputation to stand on principle. Music, but even Newman may not have been fully prepared for the final names on this list. These weren't just music actors with private prejudice. For them, racism wasn't a side belief. It shaped how they moved through Hollywood every single day. Number music 4, Ward Bond, Hollywood's most aggressive enforcer. Music: what happens when one of the industry's loudest hardliners gains serious influence behind the scenes? You get Ward Bond. On screen, Bond appeared in dozens music of films, especially westerns, often working in John Ford productions. To audiences, he was just another music-tough character actor from classic cinema. Inside Hollywood, though, his reputation was far heavier. Bond was a founding member of the Motion Picture Music Alliance and took that role seriously. During the Blacklist era, he became known as someone who pressured others to cooperate music with investigations. Colleagues described him as intimidating and confrontational. Music: if someone expressed sympathy for civil rights, integration, or music progressive causes, Bond was quick to brand them as un-American. Music: he had powerful allies. His close relationships with John Wayne and director John Ford placed him music deep inside Hollywood's inner circles. That access gave weight music to his words. When he spoke, studios listened, and when he pushed back against someone, it could damage their future in the music business. Accounts from co-workers described his frequent use of racial slurs on set music and his refusal to treat minority crew members with respect. He reportedly led aggressive efforts to isolate music or sideline people who challenged the racial structure of the industry at the time. Bond music didn't keep his views quiet. He expressed them openly and forcefully. For many, he symbolized music the resistance to change that defined parts of Golden Age Hollywood. While some actors kept their opinions private, Bond was direct. He used his influence to maintain music a status quo that excluded many voices from real opportunity. Newman's generation had to push through barriers built by men like Bond. Every step toward integration meant music confronting a system guarded by people who saw equality as a threat. Bond represented that wall, loud, connected, and determined to hold the line as long as possible. Ward Bond may have acted as an enforcer music behind the scenes, but the next man on this list didn't hide behind committees' music or pressure tactics. He spoke his views openly to a national magazine and stood by them for the rest of his life. Number 3, John Wayne, the cowboy who publicly declared belief in white music supremacy. In 1971, at the height of his fame, John Wayne sat down music for an interview with Playboy magazine and made statements
that sparked controversy for decades. In that interview, he said, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility." Those words were music printed clearly. They were not pulled from a hidden tape or twisted years later. He said the music directly in a publication read by millions. In the same conversation, Wayne defended the taking of Native American land, suggesting that indigenous people were wrong to try to keep it for themselves. He dismissed calls for diversity in Hollywood casting music and made it clear he saw no reason to change the racial makeup of the industry he dominated. He framed his views as common sense, not as something extreme. That made the impact even music stronger. What shocked many observers wasn't just what he said. It was what followed. There was no major industry backlash. His films continued to music perform well. He remained a box office powerhouse and a symbol of American toughness. The silence from much of Hollywood sent its own message. For critics, it showed how deeply certain music attitudes were embedded in the system at the time. Wayne also used his influence in casting decisions. Reports over the years claimed he resisted hiring black actors' music in leading roles and pushed for traditional casting choices that reflected his beliefs. When he directed Music the Alamo in 1960, Sidney Poitier, one of the era's biggest stars, was not cast, and many later pointed to Wayne's music history of opposing integrated storytelling. Throughout his career, he was known for favoring collaborators' music who aligned with his worldview. At the 1973 Academy Music Awards, when Sachin Littlefeather appeared on behalf of Marlon Brando to protest Music Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans, Wayne was reportedly music furious backstage. Accounts from that night claim security had to intervene to prevent a confrontation. Music, whether exaggerated or not, the story stuck because it fit his public stance. His anger at Native American activism was seen as consistent with what he had already said in print. Letters archived later in his life showed that his views did not dramatically shift before his death in 1979. He never issued a formal apology for the Playboy interview. He never publicly walked back those remarks. Music for many, that refusal to reconsider became part of his legacy. Music Paul Newman and John Wayne worked in the same industry, but they stood on opposite ends of the moral spectrum. Newman Music marched for civil rights and openly supported integration. Wayne criticized those movements' music and defended traditional hierarchies. Both were major stars. Both were celebrated. That contrast says a lot about the era. Wayne spoke music, his beliefs out loud, and kept his crown. But the final name on this list carries an even more disturbing music story. Not just because of what he believed, but because of how he reportedly reacted to music one of the darkest days in American history. Number 1, Walter Brennan. The beloved grandfather music figure with a hidden reputation. Walter Brennan won 3 Academy Awards for Best Music Supporting Actor, a record that still stands. On screen, he was known as the music-warm, folksy older man. Audiences loved him as Grandpa Amos McCoy on The Real McCoys. He seemed music-gentle, kind, and harmless. Families welcomed him into their homes through their television sets every week. But behind that carefully crafted public image, music former colleagues described a very different personality. Brennan was associated with hardline political views music and was an active supporter of conservative causes in Hollywood. Some accounts music claim that when news broke of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968, Music Brennan reacted in a way that shocked those around him. The most repeated music version of the story alleges that he celebrated the news. That claim has been debated over the years, but it remains one of the darkest stories tied to his name. Whether every detail can be verified or not, what is clear is that Brennan held strong views against music, the civil rights movement, and integration efforts. His politics were not quiet opinions. He supported groups that opposed progressive change and spoke openly music against what he saw as government overreach. The contrast between his soft on-screen persona and his reported private behavior music stunned many who later learned about it. The image of the sweet grandfather did not match the music political fighter described by insiders. And that gap between performance and reality captures the larger theme of this entire list. Music Walter Brennan's political beliefs weren't a side note in his life. They shaped nearly everything he did off music camera. He was a committed member of the John Birch Society, one of the most controversial far-right music organizations in America at the time. In 1968, he endorsed music segregationist George Wallace for president because he believed Richard Nixon was too liberal. 4 years music later, he backed John Schmitz, another John Birch Society member known for hardline music positions. Brennan didn't just quietly support these causes. He actively promoted them at a John Birch Society convention. Music he recorded audio tracks where he spoke in character as Grandpa Amos McCoy, the same warm, grandfatherly voice millions of families' music trusted every week on television. Using that familiar tone, he told audiences that music, the civil rights movement, was a communist conspiracy and claimed African-Americans were music being manipulated by outside agitators pushing an anti-American agenda. He blended entertainment and music politics in a way that
critics found deeply troubling. He didn't separate the actor music from the activist. He used the character people loved to amplify his political music views. That decision shocked even some of his colleagues. His show's music producer, Sheldon Leonard, publicly referred to him as the racist Walter Music Brennan and made it clear he did not share those beliefs. Writers whose music worked around Brennan later described his repeated use of racial slurs on set and his outspoken music claims about white superiority. Those accounts painted a picture far removed from the gentle music grandfather image seen on screen. At one point, Brennan reportedly said the 1965 Watts riots could have been stopped with a machine gun. Music that statement alone shows how extreme his rhetoric could become. His worldview was so rigid that he even labeled John Wayne, music himself known for controversial statements, as too soft. That's how music far Brennan stood on the political spectrum at the time. But the story that most defines his legacy centers on April 1968. Music. When news broke that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, the country fell into shock. Cities mourned, churches filled, the entertainment industry paused in grief. According to multiple crew members, music from the set of The Guns of Will Sonnet, Brennan reacted in a way that stunned those around him. Several accounts music claimed that when he heard the news, he expressed celebration rather than sorrow. Some reports even say he danced and laughed in response. The details have been debated over time, but the story has music followed his name for decades because of how stark it sounds. There are also claims that he music reacted similarly months later when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Whether every element of those music accounts can be independently verified or not, what remains clear is that Brennan's opposition to the civil rights movement was intense and deeply personal. The contrast between music Brennan and Paul Newman could not be sharper. Newman stood in crowds listening to Dr. King speak. He supported desegregation music efforts in the South. He narrated civil rights documentaries and risked being labeled un-American music for pushing equality. Brennan aligned himself with organizations that argued the movement was dangerous and misguided. Music. Two actors, same industry, completely different moral directions. This wasn't just music about personal opinion. These were powerful men with massive platforms. They shaped casting decisions, influenced studio music culture, and helped define which stories were told and which were left out. They reinforced a music version of Hollywood where people of color were often sidelined or reduced to stereotypes. That didn't happen by accident. Music. It was the result of choices made behind closed doors, reinforced year after year. Paul Newman saw that world from the inside. He saw the music glamour, the politics, the quiet exclusions, and the loud declarations. And instead of blending in, he pushed back. He chose music to speak when silence was easier. He chose to march when staying home would have protected his career. He proved you could be a major Hollywood star and still music stand firm on principle. The 9 men on this list each left a complicated legacy. Some hid their views behind patriotism. Some voiced them openly. Some worked quietly through influence and committees. Others spoke in interviews without regret. But all of them played a role in shaping an industry music that took decades to begin addressing its deep inequalities. Golden Age Hollywood wasn't just music, red carpets, and bright lights. It was also power struggles, political music battles, and moral crossroads that defined careers and reputations for music generations. If you found this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history eye-opening, make sure to music like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold stories from entertainment's complicated past. Your support music helps keep these conversations